40 million people across 7 states depend on the Colorado River. Most people think the danger is the river shrinking on the surface, but the deeper crisis is underground, where ancient aquifers that took 20,000 years to fill are being drained in decades. That hidden water keeps desert farms alive. And here is the problem. Once that fossil groundwater is pumped onto a field and evaporates, it does not come back. This is the groundwater paradox, and it may decide what survives in the American Southwest. The headline number is hard to ignore. 27.8 million acre-feet of groundwater have vanished from the Colorado River Basin since 2003. That volume matches the entire maximum storage capacity of Lake Mead. It also accounts for 65% of all freshwater lost in the basin over that period. NASA's GRACE satellites detected the loss by measuring microscopic shifts in Earth's gravitational field caused by the disappearance of underground water mass. The aquifers are emptying faster than the surface reservoirs that dominate the news, and almost nobody sees it happening. To understand why this matters, start with the river everyone knows. The Colorado River stretches roughly 1,400 miles from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of California. It drains 241,000 square miles across 7 U.S. states and 2 Mexican states. Agriculture devours up to 75% of the river's beneficial uses. That water irrigates 3.2 million acres of farmland inside the basin and another 2 million acres outside it. Beneath that canal network sits an invisible second plumbing system, a web of alluvial and fractured rock aquifers that served as the region's backup supply for over a century. That backup is now breaking apart. Fossil groundwater is not an underground river, and it is not a hollow cavern waiting to refill. Water sits inside microscopic pores, voids, and fractures in sand, gravel, limestone, and bedrock. Think of it like a dense subterranean sponge. Across Arizona's desert, natural recharge from modern rainfall adds only fractions of an inch per year. When scientists run carbon-14 dating and tritium analyses on water pulled from deep agricultural wells, they find 0 modern atmospheric signatures. That means the water is ancient. It fell to Earth and seeped into the crust during the Pleistocene era, specifically the last glacial maximum, roughly 12,000 to 20,000 years ago. Back then, the climate was vastly cooler and wetter. Once the last ice age ended, the region dried out, and natural recharge slowed to almost nothing. Picture an irrigation district pulling 100,000 acre-feet of this fossil water per year from an aquifer that naturally recharges only 1,000 acre-feet. The math is not a shortage cycle. It is mining. That is the first big mental shift. This is not like drawing from a bank account that receives deposits. It is closer to extracting a non-renewable mineral, identical to coal or petroleum. Water tables drop, farmers drill deeper, pumps burn vastly more electricity, and costs spiral. The field may stay green for a while, but the aquifer underneath is being spent. Once ancient water hits an alfalfa field and evaporates, it disappears permanently. None of this extraction happened by accident. It unfolded as a technological and economic response to the limits of surface irrigation. Before 1450, the Hohokam carved nearly 500 miles of gravity-fed canals through Arizona's Salt River Valley. Anglo settlers arrived centuries later, and the 1864 Howell Code locked in prior appropriation for surface water. The doctrine of first in time, first in right. Groundwater followed a different legal philosophy called reasonable use. That doctrine let landowners pump unlimited quantities from beneath their own property with no restrictions whatsoever. The turning point came in the 1940s and 1950s. Advanced deep well turbine pumps, cheap rural electricity, and booming post-war commodity prices arrived at the same moment. A severe drought beginning in 1942 dropped surface reservoir levels across Arizona. Farmers turned to their new pumping technology to cover the gap. Aquifers seemed perfect because they delivered clean, reliable water on demand. Then, the tragedy of the commons kicked in. Conservation by one farmer meant little if the neighbor simply drilled deeper into the same shared aquifer. The warnings were not new. Prominent hydrologists warned Arizona's governor as early as 1925 that the Salt River Valley's groundwater faced severe overdevelopment. Nobody listened. By the 1960s and 1970s, water tables had dropped by hundreds of feet across the region. The land itself started sinking. Miles-long earth fissures ripped open across the desert floor. Groundwater had gone from invisible convenience to visible damage. Washington finally responded with an ultimatum. Arizona would receive zero federal funding for the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal designed to carry the state's 2.8 million acre-foot Colorado River allocation inland, unless lawmakers enacted strict groundwater controls. Governor Bruce Babbitt locked the opposing factions in a room and refused to let them leave until they reached a deal. What emerged in 1980 became the Groundwater Management Act, the most aggressive groundwater code in the country at the time. It created the Arizona Department of Water Resources and carved out active management areas around the worst overdrafted regions. It demanded a 100-year assured water supply for new developments, froze the expansion of irrigated acreage, and set a target of reaching safe yield by 2025. Safe yield meant annual pumping would no longer exceed annual recharge. But the price of passing the law tells the real story. To secure political support from the agricultural lobby, Arizona granted perpetual grandfathered pumping rights to every farmer who had irrigated with groundwater before 1980. On top of that, 75% of the state's landmass, nearly all of rural Arizona, stayed almost entirely unregulated. Officials sold the cap as an aquifer rescue plan. Surface water would flow in, groundwater pumping would stop, and the aquifers would recover over time. None of that happened. The Colorado River Basin now endures its driest stretch in over 1,200 years, with 20% less surface water flow compared to the 20th century average. In August 2021, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior issued the first-ever Tier 1 shortage declaration. Arizona's supply was cut by 512,000 acre-feet. That was a 30% cut to the cap's normal deliveries. Under the basin's priority system, agricultural users in central Arizona sit near the absolute bottom of the water rights hierarchy. When the shortage landed, the cap agricultural pool lost 65% of its surface water allocation overnight. By 2023, that pool received absolutely zero surface water. But farms still needed water to survive. What followed was an emergency raid on the hidden backup. Inside the Maricopa-Stanfield Irrigation and Drainage District, a junior water rights holder, the water balance deficit exploded from 26,000 acre-feet in 2020 to 92,000 acre-feet by 2024. That 66,000 acre-foot gap traces directly to emergency groundwater pumping. The state already knew the math was brutal. Arizona's Department of Water Resources delivered modeling of the Pinal Active Management Area in 2022, showing projected unmet groundwater demand over a 100-year horizon exceeding 8 million acre-feet. Enough accessible water to sustain the current agricultural footprint simply does not exist. Farmers who could not pump enough watched their fields go bare. Federal crop insurance payouts for irrigation supply failure jumped from fewer than 17,000 acres historically to 41,278 acres in 2022. Then they surged again to 58,617 acres in 2023. Bare fields created another crisis. Stripped of vegetation, exposed farmland turned into dust factories. The EPA reclassified West Pinal County as a serious non-attainment zone for particulate matter pollution. That means the area failed to meet federal standards for small airborne particles. A water crisis became an air quality crisis. The damage did not stay underground. Every foot the water table drops tightens the financial vice. Drilling costs in California run $25 to $50 per foot for basic boring. Once casing and pumping infrastructure enter the equation, costs jump to $85 to $110 per foot. A standard agricultural well runs $40,000 to $150,000. Deep commercial wells accessing lower aquifer layers regularly exceed $500,000. Groundwater may carry no price tag at the point of extraction in most of the basin, but lifting it to the surface is never free. The electricity bill becomes the real price of water. Western Kansas shows the pressure clearly. Energy expenses for groundwater extraction eat approximately 10% of total operating costs for growing corn, actually exceeding the cost of land rent. Econometric models pin the price elasticity of groundwater extraction to energy costs at negative 0.26. That means a $1 increase per million BTU suppresses extraction by 5.89 acre-feet per year per individual farmer. Wells do not have to run dry to become useless. The moment lifting costs exceed the market value of the crop, the water becomes economically unreachable. And here is the federal contradiction. Between 2017 and 2023, farmers across the 7 Colorado River Basin states collected $5.6 billion from the USDA specifically for drought-related crop losses. Those indemnity payments surged by 297% over that period. More than $2 billion went to producers growing water-intensive hay and alfalfa. Washington pays billions to compensate farmers for losing crops to a lack of water, while also spending hundreds of millions on efficiency programs that failed to reduce overall consumption. The federal government funds the depletion with one hand and subsidizes its consequences with the other. Farmland prices show the collapse in real time. California's Central Valley saw values climb 530% over 2 decades, rising from $8,150 per acre in 2001 to over $52,200 by 2021. That appreciation depended entirely on water access. When California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014, the market fractured instantly. Properties with reliable surface water access gained 30% between 2018 and 2023. Land reliant on restricted groundwater flatlined and then cratered. The crash moved fast. San Joaquin Valley vineyards and orchards lacking surface water lost 25 to 50% of their value within 8 months spanning late 2023 to early 2024. Pistachio orchards in Tulare County sold for merely 25% of what they had been assessed a year earlier. More than 500 agricultural properties in Madera County dropped below their original purchase price. Banking data confirms the contagion. A 10-foot decrease in saturated aquifer thickness correlates with a 0.139% absolute increase in the delinquency rate of agricultural production loans. Credit follows water. A 10% decrease from the regional mean pushes total agricultural loan delinquency up by more than 23%. $399 million in troubled debt restructurings sat on the Farm Credit System's books by the close of 2022. That included $215 million in real estate mortgages and $90 million in production loans. The water underground and the credit on the surface are draining at the same rate. When the aquifer loses value, the land and the loans lose value with it. While domestic farmers scramble, multinational corporations have exploited the regulatory vacuum left by the 1980 Act. Fondomonte, Arizona, a subsidiary of Saudi dairy giant Almarai, purchased roughly 10,000 acres in La Paz County for $47.5 million to grow alfalfa for export. Saudi Arabia had banned domestic green forage production in 2015 to protect its own depleted aquifers. What it stopped doing at home, it started doing in Arizona, where rural groundwater cost nothing beyond the price of land and a drill rig. That is not trade in the usual sense. It is exporting a hidden aquifer. Riverview LLP, a Minnesota-based dairy conglomerate, ran industrial-scale wells in Cochise County's Wilcox Basin. The basin hemorrhaged the equivalent of 54,000 Olympic swimming pools of groundwater every year. Surrounding residents watched their domestic wells go dry. Ed Curry, a local chili pepper farmer with over 50 years in the area, spent $600,000 drilling deeper wells just to chase the retreating water table down. The people living on the aquifer were forced to compete with industrial pumps. Legal action eventually followed. Attorney General Chris Mays secured an $11 million settlement from Riverview. The settlement forced the company to fallow 2,000 acres and fund well replacement for impacted residents. Mays then filed a first-of-its-kind lawsuit against Fondomonte using the public nuisance doctrine. The argument was that excessive industrial pumping constitutes an actionable public nuisance identical to toxic pollution. If courts uphold that interpretation, large-scale groundwater mining can be categorized, penalized, and stopped in the same way as dumping chemicals into a river. One of the cruelest twists is that the pursuit of water efficiency can actually accelerate the damage. When farmers abandon traditional flood irrigation for precision drip systems, they eliminate the runoff that historically recharged aquifers and fed downstream return flows. Each farm improves its yield-to-water ratio, but the shared aquifer loses one of its recharge mechanisms. Every drop gets consumed. The aquifer stops cycling and becomes a strictly mined commodity. Salt makes the trap worse. Groundwater across the arid Southwest carries elevated dissolved solids from prolonged geologic contact. When farmers apply this saline water, the salts precipitate and accumulate in the soil, making it exponentially harder for roots to extract moisture. Simulation models show root water uptake drops by 81% when soil salinity climbs from 0.5 to 25 ds per meter. 70% of irrigated fields in the Arkansas Valley already show salinity damage. Yields have fallen 10 to 50%, and 25,000 to 30,000 acres have been rendered agriculturally sterile. Then, the ground itself collapses. Removing groundwater faster than it recharges strips away the hydrostatic pressure holding up the clay layers underground. Those layers permanently compress under the weight of the overburden. Elevation drops of 4 feet or more show up regularly. Gravity-fed canal gradients get destroyed. Roads crack, pipelines rupture, and water districts end up installing expensive lift pumps just to push water uphill over newly formed subsidence bowls. Projections show uncontrolled subsidence could limit future aqueduct capacity by up to 1.5 million acre-feet annually. That damage cannot simply be repaired later. Even if the river somehow returned to historic flows and massive recharge programs launched tomorrow, compressed clay layers cannot physically expand again. The aquifer has permanently lost the capacity to store what it once held. This is why groundwater collapse is different from a low reservoir. A reservoir can refill after wet years. A compacted aquifer can lose storage space forever. The clock is now moving toward another deadline. Operating guidelines for the Colorado River expire in 2026, forcing a complete renegotiation among the basin states, tribal nations, and Mexico. The Department of the Interior has committed $700 million in Inflation Reduction Act funding for lower basin conservation. That money purchases system conservation at fixed rates of $330 per acre-foot for 1-year agreements, $365 for 2 years, and $400 for 3 years. Another $152 million flows to the upper basin for drought resiliency projects. California may be showing the clearest path forward. The state's multi-benefit land repurposing program has allocated nearly $80 million across 9 regions. It has approved the conversion of over 4,800 acres from irrigated cropland to agrivoltaics, wildlife habitat, dryland farming, and managed aquifer recharge basins. Under SGMA, critically overdrafted basins must reach total sustainability by 2040. That mandate is expected to force the permanent retirement of an estimated 500,000 acres of irrigated land across the state. It is painful, but it at least admits that not every acre can keep drinking forever. The old accounting no longer works. Treating surface water and groundwater as separate, infinite resources helped build the modern Southwest. But it also hid the true cost of agriculture in the desert. The Southwest's agricultural economy will contract. The only open question is who absorbs the cost. Rural populations, indigenous nations, and ecosystems were locked out of the groundwater bailout for a century. They should not be forced to pay the full price of its collapse.